some friends of mine have been asking me what I'm thinking about Wes Huff and his comments regarding why he is not Catholic. Well, today we're going to look at one specific section of his video because it is about the papacy and why he's not Catholic, why he doesn't believe in the papacy. And we're going to look at this because this is why I became Catholic and I love to talk about the papacy. So before we continue, just let me put some typical internet disclaimers because this is the online forum and there's a lot of polemics out there, but this is not attacking Wes Huff. I do not doubt his sincerity. He does like a lot of good work when he defends Christianity as a whole. So I'm not attacking him or trying to destroy him or anything like that. But without further ado, let's listen to what Wes Huff has to say.
My next reason that I'm not Roman Catholic is the papacy. I simply do not see Matthew 16:18 being a statement about Petrine supremacy. So let me read this for you. It says, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So the way that Rome today has understood this is that Peter is the rock, and that through Peter there is a line of successors, which are the bishops of Rome, and that this specific bishop is the vicar of Christ on earth. I think this is a misreading, and I would go as far as saying that what Augustine states in this passage when he talks about it in his homilies on the Gospel of John is correct. He articulates that the rock in Matthew 16:18 is Christ himself, not Peter. And he clarifies that Peter derived his name from rock, right? So Petra in Greek, right, that's rock, and that it's not the reversed. So his actual argument is just as Christian comes from Christ, not the other way around. So we have the statement, on this rock I'll build my church, and then calling Peter the rock. Augustine argues it's the same that the same way we view the term Christian, that it's we get our title as Christian from Christ, not the other way around. And so Augustine is pretty specific on this, that when Christ said, "Upon this rock I will build my church," that we ought to interpret that as referring to the confession of Peter that he just made in context, rather than the person of Peter.
Okay, so this is basically just the typical Protestant or Eastern Orthodox argument that, hey, Peter is not the rock, it is just Peter's confession of faith. The rock is not Peter himself. So, honestly, there are multiple Protestant scholars that will actually say, hey, yeah, Peter, grammatically and contextually, is actually the rock in this passage. And it becomes even more clear when we just remember recalling the fact that Jesus did not speak Greek, Jesus actually spoke Aramaic. So, in other words, we see in the New Testament that one of Simon's names, how he is referred to, is as Cephas, which is the Greek form of the Aramaic word for rock, Kepha. So, originally, when Jesus delivered this passage in the gospel, basically, he said, hey, Simon, you are Kepha, and on this Kepha, I will build my church. On what Kepha? Well, the one I just mentioned, Peter. And also, if Peter is not the rock, why even change the poor man's name in the first place? We know that when God changes someone's name in the Bible, God is giving that person a divine promise, giving that person new identity. For example, what he did with Abram to Abraham in the Old Testament. But if Peter is not the rock that the church is built upon, which the gates of hell will not prevail against, well, changing Simon's name to Peter is pretty much pointless. Wes Huff also tried to appeal to St. Augustine, saying that, hey, the rock is Peter's confession of faith, not Peter himself. Okay, but other saints around the same time period, for example, Saints Cyril of Alexandria, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Hilary, and Jerome, all of them do admit that, yeah, Peter is the rock. So I don't really think it's that useful to just say, oh, this ancient church father and saint agrees with me, right? Because that is like the impression you get from just watching this. I'm not saying Wes Huff is actually doing that, like trying to appeal to an authority, but so like I don't think it's very helpful to just say, ah, this one guy agrees with me, and at least mention the other saints as well. Maybe I'm being nitpicky, maybe I'm just complaining, but that is just how I feel in this exact moment. But In any case, the rock being Peter's confession of faith, it does not exclude the fact that Peter himself is also the rock, because really, how do you separate or divide the confession from the confessor? Like, how exactly does that work? It's all complementary, right? Which is why with Pope Saint Leo the Great, he actually commented that Saint Peter himself and Peter's confession is the rock. So it's not this versus that. And also, regarding Saint Augustine himself, it literally proves what I'm trying to say. Because elsewhere, St. Augustine also mentioned that, hey, the seat of Peter is the rock. And what is the seat of Peter according to Augustine? The Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Peter himself is the rock according to St. Augustine. So St. Augustine does not agree with you, Wes Huff.
And Augustine doesn't argue grammatically from the Greek. I think that he's very candid in saying he doesn't understand the Greek. But I think that is what we see in the Greek. Jesus says this. So let me read it for you. I'll put it up on the screen, and you can follow along, even if you can't read Greek. He says, "Kego de soi legohoti su I Petros kai epi tute te Petra oiko do meso moi tein ecclesian. On this rock I will build my church." He doesn't say kai epi tuto soi oiko do meso moi tein ecclesian. On you, that being Peter, I will build my church.
I mean, he just said, though, that, hey, you, Kefa, on this Kefa, I will build my church. On what Kefa? The one we just mentioned, right? Peter.
He says, on this rock I will build my church. So I don't think there's an exegetical argument there for papal authority. I think Augustine is correct that it's Peter's confession of Christ's identity, not Peter himself, on which the church stands. Now, anticipating pushback, I can already hear people typing in the comments section about other things Augustine said about the authority of the Bishop of Rome that I, as a Protestant, clearly don't adhere to. And I totally grant that. I neither believe or am obligated, nor even need to agree with Augustine on everything he says about the position, authority, or posturing of the Bishop of Rome. I can, however, agree with him here. Where I might disagree with him elsewhere, I agree with Augustine when he correctly looks at Matthew 16:18 and properly reads the context of the passage, as I believe it is meant to be read.
Okay, so basically, Wes Huff admits that Saint Augustine elsewhere said that the Bishop of Rome has authority over others, but Wes Huff, this is like the mistake he makes. He didn't stop and ask why Saint Augustine believed that, because Saint Augustine didn't just randomly start to believe that. There's a reason, and in part, it was not only tradition but also scripture. He believes in the papacy, in the papal claims based on scripture. So while Matthew's gospel, which is the only thing Wes Huff is gonna address, Matthew's gospel very, very important for the Catholic claims. But what about the gospel of Luke, or even more importantly for the ancient church, the gospel of John regarding the papal claims? So if you're gonna make your case of, hey, this is a reason I am not Catholic, and you're talking about the papacy, you cannot just talk about this one passage in one gospel. You need to look at all the passages, at least acknowledge it in some way, because then your case is just very, very lacking in that respect.
But even if we grant that Peter is the rock, right? That the rock that Jesus is talking about is Peter, I still don't see this as meaning that Peter's successors are the heads of the church.
Okay, valid point, but there's so much more than just that. So he says, okay, even if Peter is the rock, you do not see how this leads to the fact that Peter's successors are the head of the Catholic Church. Well, the first thing I would say is, if Jesus created this authority structure in the church with the apostles, with one of them being the leader, strengthening everyone else, I think it's pretty obvious that Jesus is expecting the structure to continue because he himself created it. It is divinely instituted So it cannot change, it has to continue, which is why in the book of Acts, for example, it mentions how the apostles chose a successor to Judas who left his ministry, his office. So you see apostolic succession clearly in the New Testament. So then the thing is, if St. Peter vacated his office, his ministry, upon his death when he died, someone had to replace him in that office as chief shepherd over the universal church.
I also think the historical record format, at least the century following the time of Jesus, indicates there being a single bishop in Rome. So, this like 100-year period after Jesus, as the office of bishops developed into a role distinct from pastors hierarchically, it does not appear that there was a single ruling bishop, say in the late first or early second century during Ignatius's time. Rather, than addressing a bishop of Rome or a college of presbyters, Ignatius never mentions any presiding or noteworthy supremacy, authority for the Roman Catholic Church. And this isn't a fallacious argument from silence. Ignatius held extraordinarily strong convictions about hierarchical church structure and the necessity of obedience to bishops. No writer in the early church asserted the episcopal authority in more emphatic terms than Ignatius. And so his complete silence on papal primacy is an elephant in the room. The shepherd.
Okay, so Wes Huff says it's not an argument from silence because, hey, the absence is significant. Well, I'm sorry, but this is the absolute definition of an argument from silence. Saint Ignatius was giving pastoral advice to all the places he knew because, I mean, he was the bishop of Antioch, right? But he didn't personally know anyone at Rome. He wasn't giving pastoral advice to them. That was not the purpose of his letter, telling them, "Hey, submit to your bishop." That was not the purpose of that letter to the Romans. But even more importantly, Saint Ignatius, if he didn't even mention one priest, one presbyter in Rome, does that mean that there was not even one priest in Rome because he didn't mention it? Of course not. But what about Saint Irenaeus, for example, who was a disciple of Saint Polycarp, who was actually a student of Saint John the Apostle himself? So Saint Irenaeus, for example, he said that, hey, the church and Rome has the most authority. Everyone should look towards Rome for guidance. And then he listed all the successors of Saint Peter, the bishop of Rome, the individual single bishop of Rome, right? Starting with Linus and Ecletus, Clement, etc. And at his time, there has only been 12 popes after St. Peter. That's barely anything. And he learned Christianity from Polycarp, who knew John the Apostle. That's in the very, very beginning of church history. I think that speaks volumes, not an argument from Solomons.
Of Hermas from the early second century mentions, quote, the elders as an early Roman bishop should probably be understood as one of several collegiate presiding elders rather than the sole. While Stephen of Rome is the first one to initiate Petrine-based claims in 256 AD, and earlier bishops.
This is absolutely amazing. I'm really glad that Wes is actually mentioning Pope Stephen here in the middle of the 1st century, advancing the Petrine claims, because a lot of Eastern Orthodox and Protestants tried to argue otherwise. So this is an absolutely amazing acknowledgement. So I'm really, really happy that Wes knows about it and actually shares this with his audience. So this is amazing, amazing work. However, Pope Stephen was not really the first one, because we also have Pope Saint Victor I in the 190s, who is also a witness to the papal claims, because he tried to excommunicate churches all the way in Asia from the universal communion of the Catholic Church, with no one objecting that, hey, Pope, you do not have universal jurisdiction and authority over everyone else. They said, no, please don't do this. We don't think this is going to be very wise of you. Please don't. But no one said, hey, you do not have the authority. That never happened. But you also see the hints of the papacy, or the DNA or the blueprints of the papacy in Saint Irenaeus, with him saying that the Roman Church has a unique authority over everyone else. It's a safeguard for doctrinal purity, things like this. So while it is not as explicit regarding the Petrine claims itself, it still has the DNA or the blueprints for the papacy. So I think that's also worth mentioning regarding this aspect.
Exercised authority. Bishop Sylvester, the Bishop of Rome during the time of the Council of Nicaea, he doesn't even show up to the Council of Nicaea. And no one appears to think that this is some serious issue. While he does send delegates on his behalf, neither him nor his delegates are given any special privileges or seen as exercising any more or less authority than any other church leader.
Okay, so the thing with ecumenical councils is I am not going to go into too much details in this currently, but we only know what an ecumenical council is if the Bishop of Rome actually confirmed or ratified it as an ecumenical council. And an easy way to show this from like the modern period is just by looking at Eastern Orthodoxy, right? Because without that central leader actually unifying the church and confirming this, without the Bishop of Rome, there's just disagreements. One person disagrees, and everything goes into complete disaster mode, right? That's why there's so much schisms and disagreements in Eastern Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxies, right? So, in terms of ecumenical councils, I don't think it actually matters that the Pope was not present at the Council of Nicaea, or his delegates were not there, or were there but no one really cared too much. Whatever the case may be, right? It doesn't matter. What matters is that the Pope subsequently ratifies and confirms it. That is actually a very powerful witness to the papal claims. The ecumenical councils is a strong thing supporting the papal claims. It's not really a good argument against it. And you even see this at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which is basically the blueprint for how not to have an ecumenical council. It was absolutely horrendously done, completely scandalous. But nevertheless, the Pope still ratified it subsequently, which is why we believe it is an ecumenical council today.
Explicit assertion of Rome's unique overarching supremacy doesn't realistically crystallize until, I would argue, the late 4th and 5th centuries, particularly through Damasus, Leo the Great, and Gelasius.
Okay, so I would agree it becomes more obvious and explicit by the time of Pope St. Damasus in 382 AD to be exact, and onward subsequently. Like, I can accept that, but okay, still, like, you already see the papacy in action even in the 3rd century, namely Pope Stephen and Dionysius, and as I mentioned, Pope St. Victor at the end of the 2nd century. So, having a clearer witness and testimony in the historical record as time goes on regarding like the dogmas and doctrines of the church, it's completely normal. You see this with the Trinity and how it was gradually developed organically and defined.
So I don't see the papacy holding any kind of unique office in that way. I don't see that biblically, and I don't see that in this very early kind of infancy church period.
Yeah, so all in all, I think Wes Huff makes a lot of mistakes, right? I'm not doubting his sincerity at all, but I think he's really mistaken in his opinions in this section of the video and the other ones also, because there will always be arguments or objections against the truth, no matter who, even if that person is sincere. But ultimately, there is always an answer because it's the truth, right? The Catholic Church is the truth, right? The Catholic faith is the true faith. So ultimately, I have to disagree with Wes Huff here. You do see all the blueprints and DNA of the papacy explicitly, implicitly, whether it's in the Bible itself, collected and confirmed by the Catholic Church, by the way, and then subsequently in the early church. So I have to say that I'm not very impressed with this video from Wes Huff. I haven't watched the complete video yet, but I was hoping for a little bit more to engage with, to be honest with you, in terms of this part of the video. But if you guys found this helpful and want me to respond to maybe another part of the video, anything like that, let me know down in the comment section. Let me know what you think. about Wes Huff's video, my video, like and subscribe if you found it helpful. Thank you and love bliss.